Hi, everyone. I'm Ray Pawson. My formal title is Emeritus Professor at the University of Leeds, but I've had, as many of you will know, rather a lot to do with the development of realist methods.
Ray, thank you so much for being here today. And I'm so excited to welcome you to the Realist Lens and to an episode really to talk around how realist evaluation and synthesis have developed over time. I can't think of anyone better to think around the inception and the past, the present, and also the future of the approach and how you see it, particularly, since all the different stages and developments and continued developments that you can particularly see in the approach. So, I guess just to get us started, if you look back to realistic evaluation in 1997 and your work even before then, how do you think the field has evolved over the past few decades? Because you're probably the person who has seen it from firsthand, the evolution of the whole thing.
Yes, it's a good, interesting question, and it will be fun to take you back to 1997 because it was a different world. And as you say, pre 1997, when I started thinking about it, first thing I would say is when we wrote the book, that's Tilly and I, we were evaluation outsiders. Nobody knew us. No, we had no reputation in the field at all. Nick was a social theorist and a philosopher of science. I've always been a methodologist, but I was a sociologist interested in social stratification. So, as we say in English, we took a punt. We'd become involved in evaluation through a couple of minor projects. We didn't like what we saw, and so we thought, well, we're going to have a punt at trying to reform the business. Still in 1997, I should ask you, how old were you, Alexandra, in 1997?
That's a great question. I wasn't even born. I was born in the 2000. I'm 25, so there you go.
Well, so I need to explain what it was like back in the day. So mobile telephones were telephones and not computers. There was no social media. The pace of academic life was very, very slow. And people did take notice of the long argument. So realistic evaluation is quite a long argument. And in those days, the long argument could begin. It could prevail. I'm not sure whether it could happen anymore. Everyone's got the attention span of a flea, including academics, and I'm not sure that long arguments prevail. I'll get to answering your question in a minute. But the other thing is, Nick and I began in the trenches. So at that time, what we called experimental evaluation, quite quasi-experimental evaluation, was totally dominant. So we were involved in academic fisticuffs originally. I can remember at some conferences, etc. But there were real hostilities to what we had to say. Anyway, coming to your actual question about how that's changed, I think the answer is basically the argument has prevailed, at least in some quarters, and the major change is now people take seriously the idea that the subject matter of evaluation is program theory rather than programs. So I'm content to see my humble efforts fitting alongside theories of change, contribution analysis, lots of different program theory and forms of program theory analysis. And that's the answer to your question. Our approach has now become normalized. I think you've talked to Jeff Wong about this, and he likes to say we are now normal science. I'm not sure about the science bit. I'm not quite sure that we've become a true science yet. But generally, the answer to your question is realist evaluation is fairly commonplace, especially in the analysis of complex social programs.
Certainly, Ray. Thank you for that. And I love that you say as well that we're not there yet, and it's a process, and these things take time. And in the grand scale of science, it's nearly 30 years since the publication of realistic evaluation at the time, and there's still certainly massive strides, but there's always room for even in realist terms. Our theories at the end are never the end. And I guess that the process of realist evaluation and realist synthesis is also starting. Can I ask as well? I was thinking as you were talking there, if there was and this is of course a probably a difficult question to answer, but through that time, was there a turning point that you saw this was the process where it sped up the most, this now acceptance of program theory rather than programs, or for this to be more used in social science research? Do you think it's been more of a slow burner, or was there a real turning point at some point in, say, X year where this happened, that it really created a catalyst?
The answer is as it always is. It's a bit of both. So it's the drip, drip, drip of the argument that makes a difference. The turning points are probably nothing to do with me or Nick or Jeff or anyone. It's probably the acceptance of the argument in healthcare, particularly the medical research councils guidelines on the evaluation of complex programs. Those have changed over the years, and if you look at the most recent version of that, it's very realist friendly. And though my aspirations for realist evaluation and synthesis are much broader than that, healthcare remains the motor, and I think it's the change there that probably has made the greatest difference.
Yeah, fascinating, and it is true, Ray, as you say, that healthcare has made a big difference, and it's really been used in the field. What is it about healthcare you think that maybe has really welcomed with open arms this realist thinking and way of thinking? Because it is true that it can be adapted to so many different areas, but what is it about healthcare that you think has welcomed this way of thinking in open arms? Is it the frustrations of previous work? Is it the fact that it really encourages that process? What is it in your eyes that has made healthcare that process?
The negative reason is simply I would say 80% of funding goes to healthcare. So there's lots of room for rumination and argument and alternatives. But I think it's the realization, even something understood as a straightforward intervention, even pharmaceutical interventions. It always was assumed that pharmaceutical interventions were to do with compliance. If you can organize compliance with the taking of the medication, then you can do RCTs. But even the business of investigating a complaint, making prescriptions, encouraging to people to do this, that, and the other. Complexity bites even in the simplest investigations, in the simplest interventions, and I think that's now really rather well understood.
Certainly, Ray. And I think that complexity that you mentioned is, that's my field's in mental health. And when
Mm,
I look at mental health specifically and the world surrounding us, and you make a point around it as well.
mm,
And this complexity, not only in healthcare but in other fields, make it certainly a very
mm, mm,
um what's the word I'm trying to look for? A very appealing way of thinking, because
mm.
that's one of the things that I like the most. I think, Ray. I got to admit that it's a way of thinking, and that's realist lens. I think that's where the name comes from. You're seeing this program, this phenomenon, in a way that helps you think a little bit deeper than what we may see in the surface, as you call in,
That's
in
it.
your book.
Yeah, that's valuable contribution, my friend. Because I think practitioners, above all, are very quick at the idea of understanding the basic realist principle that it's how people interpret the program that counts. And experienced practitioners know that their little old intervention is understood in quite different ways by quite different people and delivered in quite different ways by different people. And so that initial grasp of complexity is there already.
Certainly, and then it moves from practice to research and vice versa, and it becomes that cycle, doesn't it? You mentioned earlier. I want to touch upon your thoughts of wanting it to go broader, and to go into other fields, and the
Mm.
ambitions that you have for realist evaluation and synthesis. Because as we look now into the future, as I mentioned earlier, it's nearly 30 years now, so we're 28 years since the first publication. But of course, since the work done beforehand as well, I don't want people to think either that it was just 1997. There was obviously work and thinking much done before then. But what do you foresee as some of the biggest challenges that evaluation and synthesis face today? Because as you mentioned, there's been some great strides. It's now part of the repertoire of social science research approaches to try and understand the world around us. But at the same time, and I'm sure there's some barriers and challenges that you can think about as we go through this process.
I've been writing a lot about this recently, and at some points, either in our conversation or on the Realist lens, I'd like you to publicize some of those things. Shall I start it slightly in the negative? In in becoming big business, really realist evaluation is in becoming normalized. Basically, what's happened is realist evaluation has been attached to endless programs and policies and interventions, and I'm worried about, if you like to put it like this, the overuse of realist evaluation in this one-off way. There have now been literally, I would guess, thousands of realist evaluations, but I'm not sure that they cumulate. I'm not sure that they confederate. I'm not sure that they learn from one another. It's all rather one-off business. Somewhat cruelly, I've called this Groundhog Day in some recent writings. Before the ink has dried on your most recent report, another invitation to tender will come along, and off you go chasing that. And there's little time to dwell. And make comparisons with other forms of evaluation. So I've written quite a lot about that, and we can maybe come on to talk about that in more detail. The big omission, I think, is that it's still program evaluation, and what I'd like it to be is policy evaluation. Now, there are loads and loads of different ways in which policy is administered, and they're completely open to the possibility of doing a theory-driven evaluation. I just glanced down at a note I've made on this. So, what are the other policy instruments that we should be evaluating other than little old programs? The whole regulation industry, legislation, tribunals, management reforms, public inquiries, fiscal instruments, capacity building, inspection regimes, government apparatus like select committees. Now, all of that is policy making. All of it is based on a theory. My public inquiry will result in this, and they can all be evaluated in the same way. And that to me is the final frontier where evaluation should be pushing. Unfortunately, it's not funded like that. It's funded by someone coming up with the latest bright idea, formulating it as an intervention, and saying, "Oh, well, we must we must make this intervention." So I'm desperately ambitious about the future.
It's fascinating, Ray, particularly as you were listing all those things. It was just reminded me of the like looking at it from a helicopter view, like really zooming out at the bigger picture and looking like around the that evaluation and all the different things that again can either constrain or indeed help for the field to go forward. I just want to touch back on something that you said there around, the Groundhog Day. I find that idea really interesting, which is, I guess, the pragmatic feasibility decisions that you're making as a researcher, or as you say, getting funding, going into the next and to the next and to the next, but also being true to the academic activity and really giving it the time and effort it deserves to all that thinking and all that process. So how do you balance that? How do you balance the necessities of funders and the pragmatic day-to-day things that you need to do as a researcher, as an evaluator, as an academic, but also being true to the iterative nature of realist approaches, the time that it takes, because it seems like it's a battle.
A good question. Answer with great difficulty. Obtaining that balance is difficult. In a sense, I was lucky in that I've not been on that treadmill. I've not run a policy evaluation unit. Lots of the funding I've got for evaluation has not been paid for by policy directives, policy directors. It's been paid for academically by the Economic and Social Research Council and so on. So I've said to them, I'm going to do this evaluation as a demonstration of possible adaptation of a method. I think the only thing I'd say, if you do have these wider ambitions for evaluation or realist evaluation and synthesis, think of synthesis. Think of the history of approaches. They don't require any evaluation infrastructure. They can be done very, very cheaply. You can set up a simple, rapid review of an area. You can historically follow through adaptations to policy. I'm thinking of things like welfare reform. There's been a whole history of welfare reform, and it's not too difficult to retrace steps retrospectively to see how different policies and programs have worked. So you can do that as an independent. You can do that as a PhD student. You don't need an army of research assistants going out interviewing people, checking measurement indicators and so on. You can pick little bits of policy to investigate yourself.
Certainly, Ray. And that bit of synthesis that you mentioned, I'd like to just touch on that a little bit, please, because there may be some individuals who may not be as familiar with realist synthesis as they're entering this podcast. So as you mentioned there, the value of realist synthesis and what it can provide in comparison to an evaluation, what would you say are some of the key characteristics of a realist synthesis in comparison to other areas of synthesis or evaluation, and that for what you're particularly talking about is useful?
The synthesis, I think, as I try to develop anyway, isn't tied to technical details. So, for instance, the idea in realist evaluation that everything begins with theory, that theory must be articulated in CMO configurations. I don't think that rather tight restriction, which I regret a little bit anyway, I don't think that applies to realist synthesis. So just thinking of some of the things I've done, probably the best one was the restrictions on smoking in cars carrying children, the ban on smoking in cars carrying children. With Nick and another colleague, no, sorry, with Jeff and another colleague, we investigated that, and the investigation draws material of all different types from everywhere. So it drew on investigations of the toxicity of smoking. It drew on the attitudes of both smokers and non-smokers towards a potential ban. It looked at the political backdrop, whether the smoking lobby and the anti-smoking lobby would support the ban. It looked at the policing of the ban. So that particular example went horizontally. It looked across many different fields. And so what it allows you to do is confederate bits of information from lots of different sources. So it did another one on naming and shaming. It's good, and the idea of naming and shaming crosses many different policies and policy areas. And like everything else, the idea of bringing the attention of people who fail to follow prescriptions. I'm not sure I'm explaining this very well, but I'll keep going. It's it's that the to know whether an intervention or policy or whatever it works, you need to look across the spectrum of instances. Evaluation looks at particular instance in a particular context. Synthesis allows you to look across the whole width of the policy. You can see, yes, I can understand it. It works in those circumstances, but not in the other. It's that what works for whom in what circumstances and in what respects. I think synthesis gives you a better range of case studies. The answers are improving as I go along here. uh, think of evaluation as case study methodology. What you learn about case study methodology is within and between case study investigations is the best way to do it. And that's what you're doing in synthesis. You're doing within case evaluations, and you're doing between case interventions. And that's good science.
It certainly is. And don't worry, bro, your answers were absolutely fine throughout. And specifically when you mention around the synthesis and the case that you make for realist synthesis, not only obviously before when it was first introduced, but now as well, and how it can be a useful guidance for it rather than evaluation. I guess there'll be people listening that they'll be very excited about that and they want to go in to do a realist synthesis and try to solve the world, in one piece. But one of the things that you mentioned in your latest book is about this stopping rules. And I guess that for those individuals who are thinking around doing that realist synthesis that you're speaking about, um, what are the key, if you had to like think of the main stopping rules that you have to think about when doing your realist synthesis, what would it be when you're thinking around your design, around the feasibility of your study or your synthesis? What are some of those, would you say?
I'm glad you mentioned this, for it is very important. What you have to realize is that all study, whatever field, answers some questions and leaves behind a whole lot of other questions. That's always the case. Now that was resisted a little bit in evaluation because the very idea was to come to a verdict, to accredit programs and dismiss programs that didn't work. So the idea of a verdict is all encompassing, but theory-driven evaluation pursues theories, and you soon realize that the number of questions you could ask by way of a program theory is very large indeed. So it's not what works, it's what works, for whom, in what circumstances, in what respects, over what duration, implemented in what way, funded in what way, etc., etc., etc. And what you immediately realize when you're dealing with complexity is you cannot answer all of those questions. So you have to limit yourself. You have to come up with some stopping rule, and there's no single stopping rule. The stopping rule is what will produce the most value, what will produce the most utility, and it's going to be different in different respects. So lots of my friends in development evaluation are worried about the long-term duration of a program. So in Uttar Pradesh or somewhere in India, a program is launched. It seems to have high success rates, but then the program is withdrawn. Will its success, will its impact continue. So in an instance like that, longevity might be the crucial thing that you want to investigate, and you would organize your stopping rules around that. In another type of intervention, uh, the classic for whom question might be relevant. So if you find your little education program, your mentoring program works for certain types of kids and not others, you go in there and then see if there are any transferable lessons. So it's it's making people quite relaxed about the idea that you cannot answer everything, but then focuses on what you'll I almost said bang for the bucks. That's not quite right. On what you think will provide the most utility. It's that you're right. Making people brave about stopping rules is important.
It's so important. And there's a metaphor that when I went to Justin's training, he used that I really love to think of this idea, which is imagining that you're in a dark forest and you have this big lamp in front of you. And when you're doing this evaluation, this synthesis, this study, that big lamp gives you shed some light into some aspect of the woods, but the rest remains dark.
Mm.
And I guess that the next piece gives you a little bit more light, a little bit more light, or indeed the darkness increases, just depending on where you go. But you mentioned there around providing value, right? And I think that's so important. Value not only for yourself, but for the people who are commissioning or funding, and importantly for the people that we're serving as well with our work. But you mentioned providing value in healthcare, and healthcare being one of the main areas that realist evaluation and synthesis and thinking has evolved. But where do you see some other promising frontiers or promising contexts for realist work in the next decade? Because I'm sure, I mean, it has also been done in education and other areas. But do you see any other areas where you think it can really make some steps?
I can answer this in two ways. My final book was an attempt to shed the mantle of evaluation research and to do a methodology for social science and to connect up that methodology with clinical science and physical science. So the big answer to your question is realist approaches deal with life, universe, everything. Persuading people of that is a monumental task. I never will, though I do draw lots of inspiration from how natural science uh, uh, progresses. I don't have a specific answer for the new emerging area. Um, um, I can think of lots. I mean, the just from the top of my head, I can remember when I started going to a lecture on ex ante evaluation as opposed to ex post evaluation, and I thought at the time this was years and years ago. How on earth can you do an evaluation before a program has been mounted? But now I've completely changed my mind. An ex ante evaluation, I think, is probably more important. Why? For obvious reasons. It gets the knowledge in before you start building and mounting the program. And how ex ante evaluation works is to say, well, what do we already know about programs of this kind? So this synthetic knowledge that you can build up, that the experienced evaluator builds up, can be put to use before a program starts, and that happens in some forms of legislation. The legislation aims to do this, but if you cross-examine the assumptions and you formally cross-examine the assumptions, then you can shape up the program in a more realistic, more economic, more adaptable way before you even begin. And that's the idea of what I would call evaluation science. That is to say, it's not the understanding of millions of discrete programs. A body of knowledge builds up when you get experience of looking across programs. You literally go, yeah, seen that before, can work, but it has this problem, and this problem. Attend to this problem, that problem before you even implement your program.
I love that, Ray, because as you mentioned, that way of thinking and that rationale can be used in all these different, areas and fields, as you say. And when you mentioned that realist thinking is for life, so as you say, I think that in every area of life, it can certainly be approached. And I guess there's no harm in trying. That's what I would say, particularly for people who are starting or that find it, a little bit confusing to start with. I would say that it's a journey, as Jeff was saying, and it's certainly worth it once it makes click in your head. I have one other thing, Ray, and I've loved hearing about your stories and the process and some of your views moving forward as well for evaluation and synthesis specifically. But as we wrap up our conversation, one of the things that I always ask guests to do in the realist lens is to provide some final pieces of advice, like top three tips, essentially, like the top tips that you would say. As you've seen the whole journey of realist evaluation from start to, and I'm not going to say end because it hasn't ended yet. Indeed, it's starting and it's very exciting. But as you have gone through all the process and as you see, as you say, some of the mentions around the future of evaluation, what could you offer as the top three tips of advice to the next generation of realists out there? If you had to say the three things that for you are key from your learnings, from your experience, from what you read, from
Mm.
everything, what would it be?
Maybe two, maybe two.
Two's good.
So the first one is for beginners, and by this I'm probably mean PhD students, maybe research assistants doing their first realist evaluation. There's something that you can't have missed if you follow the conversations on Ramesses. I'm assuming most people who are listening to this will know what Ramesses is. It's the realist discussion list. And every 6 months ago, there's a cry for help. And the cry for help says, I can't understand these CMO configurations. What is it that makes a context? And why is a context different from a mechanism? And so on. Now, there's some really good advice on this in the literature. I would recommend you read anything by Jill Westhorpe on it. And the first thing she says, it's the configuration that makes a C and an M or an O. So read that. If you're still in desperation, I offer a different piece of advice, which is the idea of a CMO can be approached in a different way and can be approached in a way that begins with ordinary language, more immediately understandable language. That is as follows. There's another mantra. Nick and I tried to change the question from what works to what works for whom and in what circumstances and why. And I just added another element to it. What works for whom, in what circumstances, and in what respects. Now, if you write that down at the beginning of your studies, ponder your program, and come up with some guesses about for whom it might work, in what circumstances it might work. Importantly, in what respects it might work. It might change this, but not the other. You should, in the space of a very short time, come up with lots of hypotheses and guesses about what some of them might be, what some of where the crucial parameters might be. And they can form the initial phase of hypothesis building. You should be able to think of, under each of those headings, 3, 4, 5, 6 possible alternatives. So even with the first think through a program, you can generate hypothesis. You become a hypothesis generator, and then talk to your supervisor, talk to practitioners, talk to whoever you can about what they might be, and you would formulate a limited set of of research questions. Start your research there. what you'll find over the course of the time when you build and refine and test and adapt them is that you will end up with CMO hypothesis. The CMO is just an envelope, a heuristic to understand causation. So that's tip number one. Tip number two is I think we've talked about this a little bit earlier, to use realist understanding in any circumstance whatsoever. And I had this mad idea a couple of days ago. Even with the enemies of evidence-based policy, the idea that policies are directed via politics. Policies are still formulated. It's occurred to thinking of the orange monster in the White House, the idea of policy as deal making, the art of the deal, as Trump calls it. Could we investigate the art of the deal? And so this is about tariffs. So what happens? Why not do a realistic evaluation of Trumpian tariff making? And it works like this: the powerful economic partner tries to bully the lesser partner by enforcing restrictions. The lesser partner responds, and the more powerful partner then accepts some of those responses, but only in a minimal way. And in the end, there's a toing and froing, which is the art of the deal, where the powerful partner gets his or her or their way. Now, so that's the idea. The art of the deal is a program theory, and what you want to look at is how does that work in practice. And if you look at what the least powerful partner does, if you look at China, the UK, Canada, the response is in a different way. So the program theory dissipates in different ways. It's what works for whom in what circumstances. So my second, it's hardly a piece of advice, it's a plea, is what almost any policy circumstances you can think of what is the theory. And if you get to that theory, you leave yourself open to the possibility of investigating it, inquiring into it.
Fascinating, Ray, as an end point there, to think like a realist, which is exactly the name, of your last book, How to Think Like a Realist, at all points, and a very nice example there at the end. And also the CMO heuristic being a way of thinking, and to not get too constrained, because I think I know what you mean, that sometimes people can feel like it's a formula of some sort, and then it can be constrained to your thinking. Whilst, as you say, it's a way of thinking configuratively that helps in that process. Right, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the Realist Lens. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, it's been a pleasure to meet you, my new dear friend, and I hope we'll have other contacts in the future. And bravo, wrong language, for your efforts to establish a Spanish community. Very well done.
No worries, Ray. Thank you so much to you and all the work of everyone who has started developing as well realist evaluation and synthesis. Such a fascinating approach, way of thinking. And for anyone listening to the Realist Lens, I hope you find it today useful as well, and hopefully another motivating inquiry to see where the future takes us. Ray, thank you so much for your time.
Bye-bye.